tell you something about Andrew. This is my boy right here. You disrespect him, you're disrespecting me.
Inside fighting. Shout out to inside fighting.
MMA World waits with bated breath for what's going to happen at UFC 300, and we are here to talk about it. It's me, Jesse Rowe with Inside Fighting, joined as always by Inside Fighting's head writer, Timmy Shoes on X. Timmy Shoes MMA on X. Timothy James, what's up, Timmy? How you doing?
That is correct. I'm good. Glad to be back. I'm glad that the UFC is back. I really hate this time of year, these 3 weeks where we have to go without fights. But that time is over, and we have some really big cards coming up this year, including UFC 300. So it's always good to talk to you, Jesse. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we've had like a month off basically from any UFC events. Coming back this weekend, Johnny Walker and Ankalaev are getting their rematch, but we'll talk about that on Insider Betting. Really, the big topic at hand right now is UFC 300 and just the anticipation of how the UFC is filling out that card. And it sort of seems like most fans feel kind of underwhelmed with the fights that have been announced so far. Now, let's just be clear about this. As it stands at the moment, there are only 5 confirmed fights for UFC 300. So that doesn't even fill out a prelim. Now, some of these fights will not be on the prelims, obviously, but it is a star-studded list so far. I want to get to it. We're going to talk about it. But the main story that I want to start today's podcast with, speaking of UFC 300, and that's a teaser for a future topic on this, is it was announced by Happy Punch that Nate Diaz is back and that he will be stepping back into the boxing ring again against Jorge Masvidal. It has not been confirmed yet. We did reach out to Nate's representative, Zach Rosenfield, who told us that there's nothing that he can confirm. He basically wouldn't confirm anything, essentially. And so nothing has been confirmed in terms of a date, in terms of a setting, in terms of if this fight's actually happening. But it does seem like Nate and Jorge fight will go down at some point. It's a rematch of the BMF title, the two men who created the BMF title in the UFC. The UFC has given their sign-off on it. So apparently this fight is happening. Timmy, what are your thoughts? Are you excited? Are you, does it not land for you? Like, how do you feel about it?
That's a lot of fun. That's a fun fight. What I want to know is who's the promoter? Is it going to be Gamebred, or is it going to be a cross with Gamebred and with Real Fight Inc.? Is it going to be bare knuckle, or is it going to be with gloves? It's a fun fight either way. I'd love to see it. Those guys, two of the biggest stars, the real BMFs in my book. I thought it was really kind of corny that Poirier and Gaethje fought for the BMF belt. I don't think there ever should have been another BMF match outside of Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. But that's fun. They should run it back. That'd be really entertaining. It's going to be better than most of the boxing fights that's going on nowadays anyway. So yeah, why not? Let's run it. I want to see it.
It's funny about the BMF title. It just dawned on me as you were mentioning it. When the UFC announced that the BMF title was going to be fought, it was announced the same day that Francis Ngannou, it was announced that he was fighting Tyson Fury. So everybody on Twitter was assuming that the UFC booked that fight primarily to overshadow the fact that Ngannou was fighting Fury. Kind of a funny little side note, little anecdote from when that.
Let's build off that, because there were similar memes recently when Ngannou announced his Anthony Joshua fight. A bunch of fights got announced. The Oliveira versus Saryukin got announced. Right. So I think it's just coincidence, but it is funny that the fans are posting stuff like that.
I wouldn't be surprised if they don't want an ex-UFC guy to take the shine in terms of fight announcements, who's using his ex-UFC status to build himself. They maybe they do want to overshadow it a little bit. Who knows? But yeah, I do think it's coincidence. But I do remember specifically that day when the BMF fight was announced. It was literally like 3 hours after the Ngannou fight was announced. So kind of hilarious. That being said, I'm stoked for it. Obviously, we're close with Nate. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's two guys that can sell a fight. It's 100% going to be a cross-promotion fight. Nate created Real Fight Inc. for this specific reason. so that he could have some control over his own promotion. Same thing with Jorge Masvidal. I think that a lot of the reason why they did this is so that in the twilight of their career, their post-UFC career, they could put on fights on their own terms, collect a bigger check, collect more, obviously a bigger portion of the payout, but also have some say, specifically have some say over who is on the card itself. Nate will have his boys, his Real Fight Inc. boys on the card. Jorge will have some of his game bred guys on the card. And I'm guessing a lot of those guys will be fighting each other. And that'll be a way, sort of like how they did with the Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz fight, how Most Valuable Promotions and Real Fight Inc., essentially the MVP fighters and the Real Fighting fighters, squared up against each other. I think you'd agree with me there.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to throw this out just in case Nate or Jorge is watching. I want to represent Real Fight Inc. against any one of the MMA media out there. They're a bunch of clowns. I would kick their asses, pick one, and I will finish them inside 2 rounds.
Ben the Bane
Nate,
Davis,
sign me up,
going
dog.
down, brother.
Yeah, I'll take it. Let's do it. It's got to be MMA though. I don't want to do just pure boxing.
Derek from Better Media. Want to get you
That'd be too easy.
Yeah,
I think Ben Davis would be more competitive.
Well, it's exciting. The fight is supposedly rumored, according to Happy Punch, it's rumored to be taking place in Las Vegas sometime in March. We don't know an exact date, but sometime in March. I mean, sign me up. It'll be an event. I mean, they could sell out T-Mobile easily. That's like, those two guys are two of the biggest draws to ever grace the UFC. I mean, they'd have to be top 5 in terms of draw, maybe like top 6 or 7 in terms of draw in the UFC, right? Those guys would have to be in the top 7, I'd imagine. Nate might be top 5.
Yeah, which is exactly why it made sense for me that those guys were the BMFs, because it was like acknowledgement that these are 2 guys who are the biggest stars, and they have their personalities. They were big, they were cool, they were awesome. Their fights were never boring. So BMF made sense for those guys. I don't want to throw shade at Gaethje and Poirier, because they're amazing fighters in their own right, but they're not Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal.
Right. Hold on 1 second. My dogs are clawing at the door. Hey, come on, bud. Michaela just left for her dance class. Now? Yeah, so now I have dogs coming in. It's a fucking zoo in here. So speaking on the topic of Nate, Nate also did tweet that he once was supposed to headline UFC 200. That's what he said. So he says he's down and he wants to headline UFC 300, which has been a huge topic of conversation over the past couple of weeks. Before we get into the UFC 300 talk, the fact that like somebody like Nate or Connor would not be on the UFC 300 card kind of feels like professional malpractice. Wouldn't you agree? Just in terms of what those 2 guys have done in terms of building the brand of the UFC over the past decade or the past 8 or 9 years. Nate and Connor belong on that card, right? Sorry, I know you can't pay attention, can you?
It's a little distracting, but no, I'm glad he's there.
I'm talking about combat sports, and there's a little chihuahua behind me. It's just,
those guys should be fighting each other as the main event for this card, because I mean, Connor and Nate are going to fight again at some point. Why not now? Why not for UFC 300? That would make the most sense. Brock Lesnar headlined UFC 100. He was also on UFC 200. So you're supposed to have the biggest stars, right? I think Ronda Rousey might have been originally planned for UFC 200, but she wasn't ready yet after getting knocked out by Holly Holm. So it was Miesha Tate. Miesha had the belts, and then Amanda Nunes ended up taking it. So, I mean, these cards are always super stacked with the biggest stars. Jose Aldo, Cain Velasquez. Daniel Cormier was supposed to be fighting John Jones at UFC 200.
Hold that thought for a second.
UFC 100 had GSP. Sorry.
Yeah. So you're leading right into what this is all about. What's been happening on the internet right now is, so far with the fights that have been announced, there seems to be this like underwhelming feeling about UFC 300, because I think that the anticipation for what was going to be on this card was so massive. Everybody was expecting this to just be the card to end all fight cards. And so far, it's just a good card. It's just a good pay-per-view card from what they've announced. And it's not that there's no stars on it. It's that it's not necessarily like a star matchup quite yet, where there's two massive stars going up against each other. I think that's what's working against it so far is, and I want to get your opinion on this. Do you feel like the announcements that have been made so far are substandard for a UFC 300 card? Or do you think that we just have to wait and see what else they're cooking up? Because I wanna just list out these fights really quick before you go there. So far for UFC 300, we have Bo Nickel versus Cody Brundage. That's going to be a prelim fight. 100% certain about that. Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan, a title eliminator fight. Calvin Cutter. I always say Cutter because of the country Cutter. Calvin Cater versus Aljamain Sterling, making his debut at featherweight. Yuri Prohaska versus Alexander Rakic. And Weili, the first title fight that was announced is Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan, which is for the strawweight title, obviously. That will not be the main event of UFC 300, but I think so far it's a good card. It just isn't what people were expecting. What do you think so far of the card? Do you think people need to wait and see, or do you think that there's some legitimacy to why people are sort of underwhelmed with what's been announced so far?
I think it's a little bit of both. We do need to wait and see. All of these fights, by the way, are amazing. I'm a little surprised Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan is going to be on this card, not because it doesn't deserve to be on UFC 100, but because I thought the UFC, I presumed that the UFC would save that fight for a card in China. The UFC has been wanting to go to China for a long time. It made sense that the first Chinese champion would be on that card, competing against another Chinese fighter. It's like a win-win.
Wait, is he on that card?
You know, I see what you did there. Very
Yeah.
good. Very good.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you.
Sean Strickland would have appreciated that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Yan Xiaonan, it's a win-win because no matter what in the main event, a Chinese fighter wins, right? So
I think there might be some issues with getting a fight done in China right now. I think that's why it didn't happen.
oh yeah, okay.
So
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a good fight. Charles versus Arman is an amazing fight. It makes sense because Islam is going to be out until the summer or after the summer. You look at these fights. These fights are amazing, but people want like big, awesome stars.
Yeah.
And you look at the champions that are available, and there's not a lot of options. There's Leon versus Bilal, which probably is going to get added to this card.
Leon already said he will be fighting on this card. So it presumably
so there you go.
It's going to be Bilal. So that's one.
Right. So okay, that's not very exciting. That's like a championship fight that could be on the prelims. Sorry, Bilal.
Yeah,
And,
it's almost like it's just a victim of timing a little bit. But did you have to put O'Malley Vera on 299 because they desperately want to prove that O'Malley is a star that can carry a pay-per-view? Did that fight have to be on 299? I mean, let's look at 299 really quick because there are some fights on there that could easily be on UFC 300 that would bolster this. Poirier versus Benoit Saint Denis, like Poirier on UFC 300, like that makes a lot of sense to me. There is that one's actually Gilbert Burns,
right now,
Peter Yan, Song Yadong. Yeah.
Card.
See, I think that it's a victim of the fact that the high expectations of it. Because if you look at UFC 299, it's not like a card that's like way better than 300. It's just that we've set a high bar for 300 where people were literally talking about Brock Lesnar coming back, Ronda Rousey coming back, Conor headlining it. I mean, they were shooting for the stars with it, which is understandable. But I mean, if you just look at the card, it's a very good card. I mean, Yuri Prohaska is going to fight on it. Bo Nickel, one of the rising stars of UFC, is going to fight on it. Probably future champion. Arman and Charles is an amazing title eliminator fight. Aljamain Sterling, the former bantamweight champion. These are big names.
The fights are good. The fights right now are amazing, but the question then becomes, what are going to be the championship fights? What are going to be the really big fights on the main card? And the problem is that there's not a lot of people available. I think if I had to guess, they're going to try to get Alex Pereira on this fight, either fighting the winner of this fight that's coming up this weekend, Walker versus Ankalaev, or this is probably way less likely, but it is a possibility, or he tries to get a third belt and he challenges Tom Aspinall because Tom Aspinall has nobody to fight right now either.
Or Izzy gets a 2-month fight camp because Izzy is because Pereira did call out Izzy to fight him. So Izzy is going to be back in February, as you mentioned. So that gives him a 2-month camp to get ready for UFC 300 to bulk up a little bit and fight at light heavyweight. If that was the case, right? Yeah. That is a fight to headline UFC 300. The trilogy between Pereira and Izzy, that one would be worthy, where Bilal and Leon as the co-main would be a little bit more acceptable. And then, obviously Jan versus Zhang Weili. I
don't see that happening specifically because I think Izzy would want more time to bulk up. When he fought Jan Blachowicz, he had a piece of pizza on the scale. He was like,
he was like 3 pounds under.
200.
Yeah. I remember that.
Exactly.
No, you're right. And I don't foresee it happening either. I love the idea of Aspinall versus Pereira, but then you're doing an interim title fight for the main event.
Yep. Yeah, it's weird. It's
that whole heavyweight situation has kind of fucked up the first 8 or 9 months of this year, in terms of what it is. And, that's a whole other conversation about the beef between John Jones and Tom Aspinall. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I agree. I do think Pereira makes it on this card. I think that is the saving grace. I think he's a big enough star to headline it, but his opponent has to be good. That's the only, it can't be Magomed Ankalaev, Timmy. Like, I just, they're in kind of a tough spot here where they're going to have to pull something out of the fire because Conor's already said he's fighting International Fight Week, which is,
we don't even know if that's actually true or not either.
So Conor versus Chandler, if they could somehow make that happen, would be the best version of UFC 300 other than Conor versus Nate rematch. But I don't see that happening if he's boxing Masvidal in March. So it just seems way more likely that Pereira seems to be the name. I think you're right.
Because in terms of champions, you got to look who's available, and he's the biggest star, and he's the only one who's going to be available.
Yeah, I mean, you're thinking about the divisions here. It's not going to be O'Malley, obviously. Not going to be bantamweight. Most likely not going to be featherweight. Because unless Volk knocks out Volk knocks out Topuria in the first round or something like that, maybe. Yeah. Lightweight, is that during Ramadan? Is UFC 300 during Ramadan?
It's in April. I don't think Islam's going to be ready until after the summer. He's also hurt.
So then there's that. Oh, that's why Oliveira is fighting Saruki on this card. So then there's welterweight, which is going to be Leon and Bilal. And then you've got middleweight. So it could be a Sean Strickland headlined UFC 300 card.
Let me tell you something about Andrew. This is my boy right here. You disrespect him, you're disrespecting me.
Inside fighting, Sean's inside fighting.